Professor Scheppele, members of the Kelly family, Chief Justice, Attorney General, Deputy President, College Principal, distinguished guests and friends. My name is Laurent Pech. I'm the Dean of Law at UCD, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all this evening on behalf of our school for the 2025 John Maurice Kelly Memorial Lecture. This lecture series honors the memory of Professor Kelly, who began his academic journey as a student in ancient classics at UCD before studying Roman law at the University of Heidelberg, from which he obtained a doctorate. Professor Kelly was called to the bar and practiced on the Leinster and Eastern circuits before returning to academic life as a lecturer and fellow at Trinity College, Oxford. A few years later, he was appointed Professor of Roman Law and Jurisprudence in the Faculty of Law at UCD from 1965. Professor Kelly then became a Dean of Law at UCD just 2 years later. During the course of his distinguished academic career, Professor Kelly revived and edited the Irish Jurist and published also several seminal texts which are well known to most of us, including Fundamental Rights in Irish Law in 1968 and the Irish Constitution, which was the first published in 1980 and is now in its 5th edition. Alongside his academic career, Professor Kelly was very active in politics, having served as Senator, TD, government minister, and as Attorney General. He retired from politics in 1989 and sadly passed away in 1991, aged just 59 years. It is my privilege to welcome members of the Kelly family here this evening. Without further delay, I will now give the floor to the Chief Justice to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, Professor Laurent Scheppele. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Among my many functions, I am also the titular chair of the John M. Kelly Memorial Lecture Committee. And that involves, in fact, light work and signing some documents, but little else, which, as some unkind people have pointed out, is very much like the day job. But in that capacity and earlier, I have attended many of the John Kelly lectures in the year since it was inaugurated in 1994. And the lecture has always had an understandable bias towards jurisprudence, a subject John Kelly taught with piercing insight and an enviably confident knowledge of the subject. He paraded a cast of characters such as John Austin, Hans Kelsen, Friedrich von Savigny, H.L.A. Hart, Lord Devlin, through the lecture theatres of this university and introduced them to young students as the old friends they were, and as if there was nothing unusual in this collection of great minds coming, as it were, to visit Dublin 4 on a wet winter's day. And as a result of that interest, John Kelly's memorial lectures have always had a tendency towards the detached, reflective and philosophical inquiry. Of its nature, it was not meant to be topical, and important though they were, there were no front pages held for an account of the evening's discourse. But it is a measure of the times that we now live in that tonight's lecture by Professor Laurent Scheppele of Princeton University could not be more topical or more appropriate to deliver, and more appropriate to deliver here and in honour of John Kelly. The title of her lecture is Democracy in Danger, the Global Challenge of Autocratic Legalism. And Professor Scheppele's work has focused on the intersection of constitutional and transnational law, particularly in constitutional systems under stress. Initially, she was best known for her analysis of those countries within the European Union and the wider European family, which were experiencing a drift towards autocracy. And she has written, together with Dean Pech, on the problems created for the European Union by what is described as democratic backsliding. But more recently, she has had to apply this scholarship to the country of her birth and where she lives and works, the USA. The question of the threat posed to democracy and the role of the courts in a modern rights-based democracy under threat is transcendent and an almost existential one. It should be of interest to us not just as members of the loose coalition of like-minded Western countries and as members of the European Union and Council of Europe, but in our own right. Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University has a list of 20 things to be done to avoid tyranny. And the second is defend institutions like courts and institutions like universities. And those institutions, he says, need our help. They do not protect themselves, and they fall one after another unless each is defended from the beginning. So even a stable constitutional democracy like Ireland's cannot be complacent. We must be alert to ensure that the structures devised to protect our constitutional democracy are renewed, maintained, and reinforced. And as importantly, that the business of defending those structures is not left to the courts alone. And these ideas are particularly relevant in the context of this lecture series. John Kelly was an astute observer of constitutional developments, and he was the first person to point out at an early stage in the development of Irish constitutional law that there was an interconnectedness between courts and wider civil society. As Judge Learned Hand put it famously, maintenance of the Constitution requires the engagement and support of the entire population. Liberty, he said, lies in the hearts of men and women, and when it is lost there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. In addition to being an outstanding academic lawyer, John Kelly was a parliamentarian and a holder of ministerial office. He also had a wide range of knowledge about and appreciation of European culture and institutions. In addition to having obtained his PhD in Heidelberg, one of John Kelly's most significant published articles was a comparison of the jurisprudence of the Irish, Italian, and German courts on the question of equality, something which had not been attempted until that time. And I would like to echo Dean Pech in welcoming the Kelly family here. Their loss is personal, but John Kelly's death was our loss as well. There are few issues which arise in the field of public law in respect of which it is always not always useful to wonder what John Kelly would have made of it. I feel sure, however, that if he were here today, he would listen attentively to Professor Scheppele's lecture. We should all do the same. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to move this as a short person so that I can see you all. I'm going to move the water over in case that's necessary. So anyway, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you so much for the invitation to the Kelly family for being here and for being related to the honoree of our lecture tonight, and to the Chief Justice for the introduction. Also to my friend Laurent Pech, with whom I've co-authored a lot of things on the rule of law. And I might say that in the audience, there's a whole group of us that have worked together on this problem in the European Union since Hungary first kind of started going off the rails. And unfortunately now a number of other countries have followed suit. And so when I was asked to give the lecture, my first thought was, well, I'll talk about the rule of law in the EU. And then I got a little message that said, but what about the United States? So I don't always talk about the United States, but tonight I will, because the US is unfortunately becoming a very bad example for the world. So let me start by just saying thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to all of you for being interested. And I hope that all of you will continue to be a friend of Americans, even as our country rather goes off the rails. So the first thing I want to do is just to say that there are many Americans who are deeply embarrassed and alarmed by what is going on in the United States today. There are also a number of Americans who are supporting, obviously, what's going on in the United States today, but fewer than you think. And I hope by the end of today to sort of show you some of that. It turns out that a lot of what was happening was actually anticipated. This was a cover of the Atlantic magazine, which some of you know has been one of the best chroniclers of what has been going on in the US. And if you were paying attention, you wouldn't really have been surprised by what was happening in the United States, what has happened since the election. And so the question is, you know, people keep asking me, is a democracy in danger in the United States? But since I've worked on this in a number of other countries before this has really come home as strongly as it has, what I'm going to do first is to kind of give you a picture of what happens when democracies are in danger, looking at a number of other places, and then to take that lesson and sort of take that framework and then put what's happened in the US in that context to kind of give us some way of assessing, is this just something we don't like, or is this something that really is a sign of, you know, democracy in danger? So let me start by saying something about what I mean by both democracy and sort of its opposite, autocracy. And the problem is, I think, that many of us assume that as long as a country has someone who was elected in the last election, still running things, you must still have a democracy. But actually, the way I think about democracy is that it's not about the last election, it's about the next one. And it's about whether a country has a real probability, a prospect of getting to a future free and fair election. And the question is what it takes to get there. And it takes an institutional infrastructure before you can be assured that you will actually get to the next free and fair election. It requires that people who are now in power have some checks and balances so that they will give up power when the time comes. It ensures that power is not captured. It also assumes a number of other things, which we'll talk about: pluralistic media environment, a civil society, opposition parties that can function. So democracy is not really a question about, is your government currently, is the person currently in power someone who was elected the last time? Adam Przeworski, the famous political scientist, has this famous phrase where he says, democracy is for losers. And what he means by that is that the essence of a democracy is that political parties have to be willing to lose elections and accept the results of elections peacefully. And that's one of the major criteria for knowing that you're still in a democracy. Now, autocracy is sort of the other end of the political spectrum. Its primary characteristic, that power becomes entrenched and cannot rotate, so that the people lose the ability to change leaders peacefully through elections. And that happens when power gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and when that power then becomes exercised arbitrarily, and there is no remedy for all of that. So I've coined the phrase autocracy is for loners because it tends to attract those people who want to be alone at the top and never leave and not share power and not assume that anyone else could legitimately wield power in a country. And so as I talk about, democracy and autocracy, that's the framework that I really have in mind. So one of the things that people often ask me is, well, why do people vote for these people who become autocratic leaders? Is it because the public has given up on autocracy, or given up on democracy, and that they vote for autocracy? So here's a little chart. This is from spring 2023, the Pew Global Survey. And they asked this question, do you think that rule by a strong leader or by the military would be a good way of governing this country? Okay, and here are the percentages that say yes in different, North American and European countries. I'm sorry, Ireland's not on the list. They only pick certain countries in certain years. But what you'll see, this is 2023. This is the year before the US reelected Trump. And basically, 32 is high in the grand scheme of things, but it's not a governing electoral majority. Even in Hungary, actually, the number in Hungary used to be higher. It's gone down the longer Viktor Orban has stayed in power, for example. Basically, what you see is that people are not, you don't have workable majorities in favor of moving toward autocracy, right? So democracy, in the sense of rotating power with checks and balances, still has widespread support, even in places where it's under threat. So then the question is, how would you know autocracy when you saw it? So these are the pictures, this is Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini. By the way, Mussolini is in that bottom left picture. He's just on horseback standing in the middle of the crowd. But this is sort of the picture that many people have of what authoritarianism looks like when it shows up, right? It's the mass demonstrations, it's the mass publics, saluting, the huge pictures of the leaders, everywhere. And what I want to say is that if that's what you're waiting for, that's not how autocracy happens anymore. Instead, this is a better picture. It's not of the people, but of the governments. The darker blue you are, the safer you are. And it has to do with, constraints on the executive. What are the ways that the constitutional system has of putting constraints on the leader so that power is not concentrated in fewer and fewer hands? Dark blue countries are in better shape. The lighter blue ones are in better shape, and the lighter the color gets, the worse off you are. And so the question is then, in these systems, what can happen is you can go from a system which has a fair number of constraints on the executive to having fewer and fewer. And the question is, how does that happen? These days, it actually happens by law. Okay. Hence, I've used the phrase autocratic legalism to describe what happens. You get a leader who, promises the people something. Usually these leaders don't promise autocracy because, as you can see, that's not very popular, actually. They promise something else. They come to power. Everybody says we have a democratic government because this person's been elected. And then they change the law. And everybody says, well, that's how democracies are supposed to work, right? Somebody gets elected, then they change the law. So what could be wrong? And this is where I'm delighted to speak to an audience in a law school, is to say, here's the problem. Clever lawyers. Many lawyers are actually defending democracy. I don't mean to say this is where the whole legal profession is going, but a lot of the way that autocracy works these days is you get this leader with autocratic ambitions, and then they use the foot soldiers of autocracy are really the lawyers. So we're not looking for phalanxes of soldiers, we're looking for phalanxes of lawyers. And when democracy dies these days, it tends to die a legal death. And that's one reason why people are not on the alert when it first starts to happen, because in the beginning stages, it looks just like functioning democracy. You elect a new leader, that leader is supposed to change everything, they change everything by law, but you have to learn exactly what the content of that law is. So what I'm going to do is start by just saying, how does a democracy get lost? These are some of the people and the countries I've been studying. I actually lived and worked in Russia for a while, worked at the Constitutional Court before Putin made a round turn and destroyed democracy there. I also lived and worked in Hungary for many years, worked at the Constitutional Court when Hungary was becoming a democracy, which is to say I had a front row seat for it going downhill. We have other leaders here from Poland, from Turkey, from Brazil, from Venezuela. There are other countries that have actually been relatively either democracies in good health or democracies that look like they were getting better, and now they're not, or now they're severely damaged. So I've looked at a lot of these places, and what I'm going to run through is the kind of checklist of what happens, or the set of stages of what happens as autocracy settles in, which is to say, I want to tell you the autocrat's playbook. So the first stage of the autocrat's playbook is that the autocrat, aspirational autocrat, wins elections that is free and fair. And you say, how can that start the process? And the answer is, that's crucial to the legitimation of what the autocrat's going to do next. Okay. Now, free and fair elections lead to good governments, obviously, right? So the question is how you tell the difference. It turns out in a surprisingly large number of cases, these aspirational autocrats give you some signal ahead of time. So, for example, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, had both actually worked with the military to try to overthrow their governments before they were elected president. That was sort of a sign. Viktor Orban lost, he had been prime minister from 1998 to 2002. He lost the 2002 election. He lost the 2006 election. He denied the results. And actually, after 2006, we know that he actually mobilized some street violence to try to delegitimate the government that was elected in 2006. Mr. Erdogan, his party had been banned and he had been jailed on the way to becoming first mayor of Istanbul and then the prime minister and then president of Turkey. So there were signs ahead of time that there was potentially something to worry about these particular people and how deep their commitment to democracy was. So that's the first step. Be careful what all the signs that you're looking at. So then what does an autocrat do? So surprisingly often what happens when aspirational autocrats are elected is they capture the parliament or they neutralize the parliament. Now, how is that usually done? Well, oftentimes, especially in a parliamentary system, a prime minister is guaranteed a parliamentary majority. So how do you keep the parliamentary majority behind you if you're not doing democratic things, right? And the answer, there's some interesting answers. So one of the things that Viktor Orban did in Hungary, actually Emmanuel Macron threatened to do it, but he didn't do it, which I'm looking at, I'm happy about. What Viktor Orban did at the very beginning was he said, Hungary's a small country. We have a parliament that's almost 400 people. That's too many. Why don't we cut the size of the parliament in half? And actually, even the opposition thought that was a good idea. You save money. Why do we need this? So they passed a constitutional amendment that cut the size of the parliament in half. And then Orban went around to his party, his members of his MPs sitting there in the parliament and said, if you don't vote for every piece of legislation I put in front of you, you will not be allowed to run next time and half of you will be gone. Instant party discipline, right? So that's just one thing that happened at the beginning. But often you find that, parties play in teams. And so the parliament will just support whoever the executive is, even when they're introducing laws and changes to the constitutional system that move in an autocratic direction. Sometimes, surprisingly often, parliaments just pass enabling acts. They say, we're having a crisis, the aspirational autocrat will declare a crisis. Parliament says, fine, you handle it. We're going to give you all these powers. maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. You all know, the Hitler rise to power story and the German Enabling Act, but that was not the only time that happened. After 9/11, a lot of governments acted like they were in an emergency and delegated huge amounts of power to executives. So it's often the case that Parliament gives up, or that the executive starts to exercise powers that would normally be parliamentary powers and the Parliament says nothing. But it's surprisingly frequent how often parliaments just give up and they don't push back. Sometimes executives will prorogue or dissolve a parliament on the way toward autocratic control. But again, parliaments are very often not the best actors in this story. Capturing the judiciary is also really crucial. The mode of choice, the method of choice these days for autocrats is to start with the highest court. It's easiest to capture, has the fewest judges. And sometimes this can be done in a very clever fashion. So for example, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, this was when Turkey had just become an accession country and was under some EU pressure to have a better human rights record. So what Mr. Erdogan did was to expand the jurisdiction of the Turkish Constitutional Court by giving it a German-style constitutional complaint. So individuals could take their personal human rights cases to that court. The EU cheered, the Council of Europe cheered, everybody thought this was a great idea. Then when that court got flooded with cases, Mr. Erdogan said, we need more judges on that court. The next thing you knew, he appointed a lot of loyalists as judges. That was so successful that the next year, Viktor Orban did exactly the same thing in Hungary. Changed the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, was going to expand the number of cases, more judges, and there you go. Okay, so it can be under cover of doing something that looks like good government. So the other thing to do is change the system of rewards and punishments, right? So one of the things that happened in Poland, they created a disciplinary chamber of the Supreme Court to make sure that judges were following the law. Okay, well, that disciplinary chamber was not mostly about that, right? The disciplinary chamber turned out to be policing which judges were making decisions that the government liked and didn't like. The disciplinary chamber was specially created. It had on it only judges that the government had put there. And then suddenly you change the whole incentive system. Other things that have been done. So Viktor Orban, I think, was the first to suddenly lower the judicial retirement age and the civil service judiciary, lop off the whole leadership structure of the judiciary. And it was such a good idea that the year after, and this was, if you remember, Viktor Orban has never been known as really a fan of Islam. Okay, he borrowed the Constitutional Court thing from Erdogan with lots of coordination between the Turkish and Hungarian governments. But then, more surprisingly, Orban passed on the system of lowering the judicial retirement age to Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood government that briefly existed. And they lowered the judicial retirement age before Mr. Morsi was thrown out. Then, of course, it moved to Poland, which did the same thing. So again, you can just lop off the leadership structure by just changing the results. Sometimes you get court reorganizations. We're going to set up a new court, especially new administrative courts, where you can channel a lot of the cases involving the government to a specialized court. So again, capturing the judiciary can be done in lots of different ways. Capturing the bureaucracy. So how is this done? Well, surprisingly often, new autocratic leaders want to find a way to take whatever civil service protection that permanent sort of workers, government workers have, and relax this. So again, Viktor Orban, when he came to power in 2010, was under an IMF austerity program. I might say, some of you know, the current president of the ECB was here yesterday. And one of the things that I credit her with is changing what the IMF used to do, which is not to come in and demand austerity in such a way that it hits state workers and people who are disadvantaged. So they have, both the IMF and the ECB are better. But after the financial crisis, Hungary was under this austerity program, and they were told they had to shrink the size of the state. So with IMF approval, Viktor Orban suspended the civil service law, fired pretty much all the people in major parts of the government that were not on his team. Then they stole the private pension fund, paid off the IMF, and then hired back their own people. So that's one kind of thing. In Russia, the vertical of power language, Vladimir Putin, I'm getting them confused for obvious reasons, but Vladimir Putin said, we need to strengthen the vertical of power. So I need to be able to issue a command that goes all the way down through the Russian state to the regions. And so this was also an occasion for replacing lots of bureaucrats with political appointees. So the point is after, and this happens after, in Benin, actually, a lot of civil service workers were fired as you had an aspirational autocrat come in. So again, this is a standard operating procedure. And the idea is to have a loyal bureaucracy. Next, okay, systematically dismantle other checks on executive power. So one thing you see as aspirational autocrats start to get entrenched is they start to govern by decree rather than by legislation. And this is where acquiescence of the parliament is crucial. Sometimes the parliament will give the executive more decree powers, and then, suddenly you're in a government by decree. Hobbling oversight mechanisms, so simply not reporting the things you're supposed to report, transparency requirements disappear. Failing to follow good government rules of all kinds, firing any executive branch employee that insists on challenging the leader. Again, it depends on where the checks are in every given constitutional system, which is why you can't just say, here's the one signal. But again, refusing to acknowledge or obey court orders or to try to get out from under them, refusing to acknowledge the power of the legislature. The critical thing here is just to see in any particular government what keeps the executive from amassing power and to focus on those particular elements. Filling key independent positions with loyalists, okay? And here, what's interesting is that what's crucial are what I call the repressive offices. All the things that can go after your opponents. So it's important for these governments to install friendly prosecutors, prosecute your enemies, pardon your friends, and criminal investigators, ensuring loyalty in the police, military, and intelligence services, creating new loyalist police units. Viktor Orban, shortly after he came to power, created a new anti-terrorism police. The anti-terrorism police turned out to be a brand new supercharged police force that was under cover of darkness, given unlimited surveillance powers against pretty much anybody who's in Hungary, and I think beyond, but certainly in Hungary. There have now been multiple European Court of Human Rights decisions that said this is actually an unlawful arrangement, and the government has not changed it since that time. But again, capturing the police is really crucial. And the tax enforcement office, any kind of office that can put people under investigation and harass them is, again, logical target. Creating a media echo chamber. Okay, you can see that there are a lot of different steps, but it's all about trying to get rid of all of the sources of opposition to some aspirational autocrat. So creating a media echo chamber and ensuring that the public doesn't actually hear anything other than sort of pro-government news, right? And again, Viktor Orban was the leader in this because he actually had friendly media when he came to power. He then took over the public broadcaster, turned it into a media sort of echo chamber. Same happened in Poland. The public broadcaster was one of the first things hit so that people were getting like all government news all the time. Sometimes the media can be weakened by new media regulators who will, again, this also happened in Hungary. The new media regulator would fine media organizations that were not providing fair and balanced coverage, which basically meant not reporting the government in a positive light. What you also see sometimes is threatening business leaders who own media by threatening their other business interests so that they will bring their own media organizations to heel. And then that old strategy, bringing libel actions against everybody inside, particularly against the media, so that the media will be bankrupted, even if the media can win the cases. It's the process, which is the punishment. And if there are enough libel actions, you can weaken the perilous financial situation of many media. So again, this is another kind of thing that the government can organize. In Hungary, actually, the public prosecutor that Orban installed when he came to office was himself suing media for libel. Anyway, yeah. So then threatening civil society and the political opposition. So in many countries, and I don't know the situation in Ireland, I'd love to hear, surprisingly many NGOs are living on state grants or living on various kinds of forms of state support. Some of that is because NGOs are performing social services and then they wind up, getting state funds. One thing that, again, Viktor Orban did when he first came to power, he had studied the state budget very carefully and basically cut off all the money to any organization that was likely to oppose him. And then subjecting civil sector groups to intrusive surveillance, suddenly requiring new accounting rules and new forms of disclosing assets by the civil sector. That's another very common thing. Criminalizing the actions of the civil sector. One of my least favorite examples was that during the migration crisis, In 2015, Viktor Orban, Mr. Anti-Immigration, figured out a way to basically deny asylum to all the people who were going to try to claim asylum in Hungary. And then as soon as the asylum seekers were denied asylum, their lawyers could be prosecuted for violating anti-trafficking laws because they had helped somebody unlawfully present in Hungary cross the border and try to stay there. They were using EU anti-trafficking law for some of that. So again, there's lots of different ways to criminalize the opposition. Also going after opposition political parties. This becomes particularly an issue where there's national financing of elections. You control the finance office, you start to enforce these rules in a very, shall we say, nitpicky kind of way. You can actually then result in not giving funding to opposition political parties, spreading disinformation about political rivals. So this again, if you've got the opposition under surveillance because you've already been controlling the police and their surveillance apparatuses, what you can do is find out all kinds of dirt on the opposition, and then it suddenly surfaces on social media. And then you're just trying to discredit everybody who might stand up to the leader. And of course, investigating and jailing political rivals. I'm almost done with the checklist. I've got 10 points. Okay. So encouraging private violence. So this is something that, happens with surprising regularity. I always say when people are looking at what are the signs of autocracy? Again, if you have the kind of 20th century dictatorship model in mind where, the police and the military show up in the streets, that's not what happens typically in these new autocracies. Instead, it works more like a tsunami. Okay, so if you're on a beach and there's been an earthquake in some ocean near you, the sign that a wave is coming is that the tide goes way out. Suddenly there's just no water. And people kind of notice that. What it should be is a sign, run, right? Because the next thing that happens is all that water comes back at you and sort of hits you when you're on the beach. Sorry, that's the tsunami analogy. But this is also what happens with violence in some of these systems. The police and the military are withdrawn. And then what happens is it leaves this unpoliced space for private actors to move in and beat up folks. And it's militias, it's gangs, it's football hooligans. And so you see this over and over again where there are private actors working with the government and the police withdraw. So that it doesn't look like actually the violence being brought to bear is state violence at all. And so this again is kind of a characteristic of these new autocracies. And then finally, the last step, and then I'm going to turn to the US, is to rewrite the election laws. After you control everything, it becomes a breeze to figure out how you win the next time, because you've weakened the political opposition, you start to control the media landscape, you've weakened civil society, you've got the courts and your parliament sort of on side, you've got a loyal bureaucracy. Just go through all those steps, and then it becomes relatively easy to figure out how do you modify the election rules so that the leader cannot lose. Okay? And there are all kinds of election law tricks. What's interesting is, of course, that autocratic leaders go on having elections. There are very few autocratic leaders that cancel them, but they engage in gerrymandering. They engage in voter suppression by law. What's interesting is they very often install, because you can see the percentage of people who are really in favor of autocracy is not usually a majority. So you have to do something else. And a lot of that means fiddling with proportional representation so that you don't have it, or you accentuate the differences so that your party can win. Election denialism, or sometimes even election coercion, threatening loss of government benefits for wrong votes, and physical violence and things of that kind. That kind of comes later in the stages. Okay, so those are, from looking at all these other countries, these are the steps, and so the question is then, what do we make of this? Some of you may recognize this is the Elon Musk has this new alleged government department called the Department of Government Efficiency. That's the symbol, the Doge, this was from the Bitcoin thing that he was involved in. And so we're seeing all over the government, this Department of Government Efficiency symbol. And so the question is what exactly is happening in the US? Okay, and so here's where I want to say that, you might be looking at the US and saying, well, Trump 1.0 was just chaotic, but we kind of survived it. Yes, he dropped government on the floor and kind of hoped it would break. But the US got through it. It did not become a dictatorship. We survived it. So what could be the problem? And the answer is Trump 2.0 is massively different than Trump 1.0. And the reason why is because he worked together with a group of conservative organizations to create this thing called Project 2025. It's a 900-page report. You can read it. He actually had a blueprint, and he came in with a plan. He sort of delegated it to other people. The one thing that Trump had done in his first term that really moved the US along toward autocracy was to be was to outsource appointing judges. And particularly there were 3 judges on the US Supreme Court that Trump got to appoint. And those judges have made a huge difference in the jurisprudence of the courts. And I think what he learned from that was that if you plan ahead and you put people in charge who know how to do this, you too can have a successful presidency. I don't know if you've noticed, but Trump has actually played golf, I think 1/3 of the days that he's been president. And so he's not governing. He's not the one doing it. He's outsourced it. And Project 2025 was the blueprint. It was written by this group called the Heritage Foundation. And lest you think I'm just spinning wild conspiracy theories, there's actually a formal memorandum of understanding between the Heritage Foundation in the US and something called the Danube Institute in Hungary, which is Viktor Orban's English language think tank. And I must say, when I read Project 2025, which was published in February 2024, so ahead of the election, my first thought before I knew about the connection with Orban was, oh my God, this sounds just like it. And sure enough, so here we are. We're now in this other system. So Trump was reelected. He hits the ground running. I think as of yesterday, he's issued 107 executive orders. Hard to keep track of them all, and some of them are very elaborate. And what started happening was immediately everything everywhere all at once. And I'm sure you've seen that here. And believe me, there's even more of it when you're in the middle of it. So, and he does all kinds of outrageous things. I mean, claiming the US wants to, turn the Gaza Strip into Disneyland, basically, but also letting Elon Musk, who has this government agencies have to be created by Congress. There was no act of Congress creating the Department of Governmental Efficiency. Nobody knows under what legal authority is he acting, or all of his minions. He's been breaking into, sometimes physically, buildings and taking over data processing systems. So there's just a whole lot of chaos going on. So the question is, yes, it's chaos. In that sense, it feels like Trump 1.0, but is it autocracy? And that's where I want to run you through the checklist, but looking at the US. So, did Trump win the 2024 election fair and square? Absolutely. Did we have a warning? Absolutely. And it's not just that he tried to overthrow the results of the last election, but he actually said during the campaign that he will be a dictator, but only on day one. Like, don't worry, it's just for one day. And he kept playing with that metaphor like throughout the campaign. So you can't say that people didn't know. He also, of course, had been convicted of 34 felonies in New York State, and he had 3 pending criminal indictments before the US Supreme Court basically stalled all those cases out so that they couldn't actually proceed. But what did come out was all this public evidence that he had planned to seize power illegally. So again, it's the classic case of the autocrat who lets you know, and then people don't believe him. More warnings. So what about Congress? Some of you may have wondered what happened to Congress. And so the Congress has not been helpful. There was one thing they did, because at the very beginning, Trump said in our system, to be a cabinet official and a number of other sort of important positions, president nominates, the Senate must confirm the nominee before that person can take office. Trump floated this idea that maybe the Senate should just go into recess, and then he can make recess appointments, which is to say, without advice and consent of the Senate. That's a legal option. I'm sure Trump didn't read the Constitution himself, but his advisor said you could do that. This is the one time Congress pushed back. They said, we're going to actually have hearings. That said, they truncated all of the background checks so that when they were having the hearings, they didn't actually have before them all the useful information, and they approved basically everybody. Trump then started just saying, I'm not going to spend any money. So we're just going to suspend all the money the US government is spending. And that's not a power the president has. We have constitutional law to the effect that the president must spend what Congress tells him to spend. And so then the question is, why isn't Congress doing something? This is the House Speaker speaking a couple of weeks into the Trump administration saying, well, when Congress appropriates dollars for the executive branch to use, we built in a broad amount of discretion. So in other words, we're not going to do anything. There was then a resolution that came up a couple of weeks ago where there was a question about was there going to be a budget? And this was a situation where the Democrats allowed a budget to pass the Senate when they had the power to veto it. The problem is if they vetoed the budget resolution, it would have shut down the government. And the Democrats were so afraid of being blamed for the shutdown of government that they approved this Republican budget that had a whole series of proposals in it that the Democrats would never have gone along with. So basically what's happening is our Congress is not stepping up to the challenge of trying to figure out how to govern with an autocratic president. What about the judiciary? Well, Trump was able to get 3 nominees onto the Supreme Court early on. And some of you may have noticed that before Trump came to power this summer, because of the criminal actions pending against the president, the Supreme Court ruled that, I always like to phrase it differently. I think the way to read their opinion is that Congress may not constrain the president with criminal statutes. It was a broad sweeping immunity power. Knowing who Trump was and knowing that he had a very strong probability of being elected, in part because the Democrats fell apart before they tried to revive. But again, Trump enters office with this broad immunity, which means he cannot be prosecuted for anything he does. Gives him open permission. That said, since he's taken power, all these executive orders, many of them are executive orders that change what had been law as of the time he took office. And in the US, as here, an executive order or order in council cannot overturn statutes or the Constitution. And yet everyone is acting as if that's the case. So there are now 162, as of this morning, lawsuits that have been brought against the Trump administration for all these executive orders. And the lower courts have been actually pretty good about issuing, restraining orders, stop the presses, preliminary injunctions, rollback orders that you have to go back to what things were before, you started doing all of this. But Trump is now leading an attack on the judiciary. So Trump has floated the idea that judges who stand up to him should be impeached. Members of his own party in the House of Representatives, which is where the impeachment resolutions have to originate, have introduced several resolutions against these judges that are finding against Trump. And plus they're all getting threats. So the number of threats against the judiciary has really spiked. I'll say something more about that later. So the judiciary is really under heavy, heavy pressure to go along with Trump, knowing that at the top of the pile is the Supreme Court that is very likely to approve a lot of these executive orders as law. So, we're all sort of waiting for that to happen. Right now, the lower courts are holding the line. Politicizing the civil service. Well, so far as we can tell, because it's really hard to get the numbers, about 125,000 federal workers have been fired so far. And a lot of this happens because Elon Musk, of uncertain legal authority, fires them. He comes into an agency and he just says and sends out notices saying you are all fired. People are locked out of their offices. They go to use their badges, to get into the building and suddenly discover that the badge doesn't work. And one of the more audacious things, there's an organization some of you may have heard of called the U.S. Institute for Peace. That's an organization that actually was created by an act of Congress, but it's a private foundation. Elon Musk and his minions broke into the building physically with the assistance of the DC District of Columbia Police, marched out the leadership, and went in and then fired everybody. These were people who weren't even federal workers. And now they're claiming to seize the building for federal uses. It was a privately owned building. Okay, so again, there's legal actions, but this is the kind of stuff going on. There was this memo called the Fork in the Road memo, which was sent out to every federal employee. Basically, Elon Musk and his people broke into the HR department of the US government, namely the Office of Personnel Management, put in a new server, put in a new email system, and they can blast emails out to every federal worker. The Fork in the Road memo says, we really would like you to leave office and we will pay you to September if you agree to quit now. They were so inept at figuring out who the federal employees were that memo went to every single federal judge as well. Obviously, they don't have the authority to fire judges. None of the judges actually took the offer. But still, this is kind of what's happening. So again, they're trying to politicize the civil service by getting rid of everybody who might stand up to them. Dismantling checks on executive power. So Trump is just governing by decree. including in violation of standing law, right? So every time I do these briefings for scientists and some of my colleagues, and, I've been doing a million Zooms a week, I keep saying, and you can't change statutes by executive decree, but everyone's acting like these are real laws. Congress is not standing up, like I said. So this is where Trump is just doing whatever. He will issue, some of you may have heard that there are now, I think, 7 law firms against which there have been individual executive orders saying to the lawyers in the law firms, they cannot have security clearances. And in the most recent ones, Trump has been saying no one from this law firm can get access to a federal building, including the federal courthouses. Okay, so he's just doing all this stuff. Obviously, he's also running all of his own businesses. When he makes these deals, there are three of the law firms have caved in. I might mention their names because maybe that some of them have a global presence, and maybe Europe can do something about these global firms that are caving into Trump. So Paul Weiss and Skadden, Milbank today. Some of those firms have agreed to put in, Milbank and Skadden have agreed to put in $100 million of pro bono legal advice to any group that Trump designates. And it doesn't say aligned with the president. It's like personally, Trump is going to tell these law. Okay, so conflicts of interest and private. And then there's the whole Elon Musk thing. I don't know if you saw that the president was trying to sell Teslas on the lawn of the White House last week. That used to be something we thought was not really something you could do. Okay, so installing loyalists. So the most crucial thing has been the decimation of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice in the US is a combination public prosecutor and Ministry of Justice. It does both functions. The woman in white here is our new Attorney General. She was actually a lawyer for Trump personally before. And she has she's literally been saying every time that a violation of federal law comes to her attention, she gets right on it. If it's somebody from the opposition that committed that violation, and she has openly said they are not going to prosecute any violations of federal law that are coming from the Trump administration itself. And she created the quote weaponization working group to go after everybody who worked in the Department of Justice and every agent of the FBI who worked on any of the cases, not only against Trump, but against any of the January 6th defendants. So whole swaths of FBI agents and career prosecutors have been fired. The new head of the FBI is this guy, Kash Patel, who, as you can see in the headline, he has vowed retribution. And they are literally weaponizing the Justice Department and the FBI against opponents. And I put the Pete Hegseth, he's a Princeton alum, I hate to say, but he's our new defense secretary who has, alienated Europeans at a rate probably unknown for a national leader. But one of the first things he did when he became defense secretary was he fired the heads of the legal corps of all of the military services. So the top ranks of lawyers in the military have all been fired and replaced. So it's not just in the civilian sector, but also in the military sector. Turning the media into an echo chamber. This started after the election, before Trump took office. Trump and a lot of his allies were filing libel actions against, and we have a doctrine, if you want to think law as it existed before Trump came to power, it still exists. It's very difficult for a public figure to win a libel action because we have, the ability to criticize state officials. They filed these libel actions, and what happened was that one after another, major media organizations paid off Trump personally rather than contest a case that they knew they would win, because they knew if they won, he would come after them, and they just decided to back down. So a lot of news outlets have stopped criticizing Trump. The Washington Post just basically abandoned its editorial page. The LA Times also is like no criticism of Trump on the editorial pages. So you're seeing media capitulate. Attacking opposition parties and civil society. So last week, Trump issued an executive order that canceled the collective bargaining agreements with 80% of the unionized workers in the federal government. Just unilaterally canceled them. Of course, it's going to be a lawsuit, but in the meantime, there are no collective bargaining agreements that his administration will recognize. They've gone after universities. My own university had, I think, 24 grants cut yesterday because our president spoke out last week. Columbia University and Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania have been the specific targets. Those are all universities, by the way, in which the presidents of those universities were driven out in a kind of fight with, Trump, people on Trump's side of the aisle before. So they're just picking off universities. They're cutting massive amounts of funding to biomedical research, which is of international importance. And they're picking off law firms. So it's just they're going after one target after another. And unfortunately, what's happening is that the universities and the law firms are just carrying private violence. Trump pardoned all the January 6th defendants, no matter how much violence they had committed. Some of them have committed 3 and 4 and 5 crimes since they were pardoned. Trump has pardoned all the new crimes. And now we're finding both from members of Congress and the judiciary that there's a rise in threats, not only against members of Congress, but against their families. And so this is, again, and then Trump has been revoking security details from people that have offended him in various ways. And then rewriting election law. So two things to say here. One was that there was an executive order last week in which Trump now says every state, again, an executive order is not allowed to do this, but never mind. Every state must now guarantee that every voter is a citizen. So you have to provide proof of citizenship and re-register to vote. If that actually gets treated as real law, it will mean we cannot have an election next year, because you can't re-register the entire public with citizenship documents. We don't have national identity cards. Only 35% of the American population has passports. It's unclear what other documentation you could provide. So they're trying to throw the election into chaos. And in the meantime, Trump supporters are arguing that even though our Constitution limits a president to 2 terms, there are ways of reading the 22nd Amendment to allow him to run for a 3rd term. I can tell you the legal arguments later if you ask. So what is this? Where are we? So the US is in serious trouble. It's marched all the way through the autocratic checklist, and we're not even 100 days in. I really am alarmed. Most of my American colleagues are not, because they haven't seen it happen elsewhere. But literally on every single one of these points, Trump is hammering away at this. So what can be done? And I'm going to conclude on a slightly optimistic note. And it comes from the work that I've done in the EU with many of my colleagues sitting here in the audience, that when Hungary started going off the rails, and then when Poland started going off the rails, what a lot of us did was to say, well, look, the autocrats attack national constitutional law. But in the EU, at least, in the Council of Europe, there's law above that. There's law above that that actually guarantees, or so we thought, that countries that are member states of the EU, countries that are part of the Council of Europe, have to honor their transnational commitments. So I was delighted to find, and I'm looking at my friends in the audience with whom we've been on this long struggle for 15 years, to invoke EU law, to try to make that law become real so that you could use it to enforce it against the member states that were failing, okay? Now, what do you do with the US, which never belongs to anything it can't control? So there, the idea is that, well, state and local law can help. And that's where I'm going to show you that actually we have a little bit of hope. So a little bit of concept. So the idea of the rule of law, we all honor. Usually when people say that, what they're talking about is one level of law, just the national legal system. And in a federal system, it's usually just one level. Okay. And what the rule of law is designed to prevent are signs like this, right? Where you're given contradictory instructions, where there's some kind of internal problem with stability or publicity or non-contradiction within a legal system. But what happens when there's an autocratic takeover of the national level, it falls out of sync with any transnational law that country might be bound by, but it also might fall out of sync with any federal law, state and local law that government might be involved in. So what I've been developing, I started in the context of the EU, was to say, well, what we need is a concept of what I call the rule of law writ large, which is where you don't just look at the one layer of whether that one layer of the legal system is consistent, coherent, predictable, and all the kind of rule of law virtues, but you ask whether the whole system of transnational, national, subnational commitments are also in sync. Okay, and it may be that if you've got an autocratic takeover of this one level, you may even have to break national law in order to bring it back into coherence with the other levels. but it doesn't mean it's a lawless process, right? It's still governed by law, just law at a different level. And so I worked with my colleagues here on this. We started by trying to say, well, look, there's this Article 2 in the Treaty on European Union, like certainly we can make this enforceable law. And when we started, the answer was, well, that's dumb, right? Like nobody would think this was legally enforceable. And now those of you who know EU law in the audience will know we've made a huge amount of progress. Not only has the Court of Justice recognized that rule of law is an actually enforceable idea, but they're also pushing on democracy now. And I think all the values are something that the Court of Justice is open to enforcing. So what do we do in the US? Well, in the US, where we don't have that level, what we have instead is federalism. And this is a map, and I'm sorry to say the US, being exceptional, always reverses the colors that you would use to describe things in Europe. Okay, so red is conservative and blue is liberal. Sorry. But the blue states, which are the ones that have Democratic Party leadership, and in fact, the blue ones on this map are ones that have single leadership. So it's the governor and both houses of the parliament, and also then the attorneys general, who are the kind of top legal officials of the state. Those blue states have been actually pushing back against Trump. And so how have they done that? Well, the blue states attorneys general actually are the only ones who saw this revolution coming. They started meeting a year before the election and said, what if? They were taking all the signals, and now they meet daily. And they've been actually in the forefront of actually bringing a lot of these cases against the Trump administration. And so this is a quote from a recent podcast. Nearly 2 months into the new Trump administration, Donald Trump's radical agenda has been stalled in the courts. And that's in large part due to these state AGs from the blue states. And so they are really acting. These are just some of the cases that they brought. So they've tried to unfreeze all the federal funds, tried to stop this so-called birthright citizenship thing, in which suddenly people will be deprived of citizenship. They blocked Elon Musk from accessing Treasury Department data. It's all the big cases that are challenging this are coming from the blue state attorneys general. And the courts have by and large given them restraining orders and preliminary injunctions. And so overall, there's 162 cases, only 10 or 12 of them have come from the state AGs, but those are the big ones. We've got all this litigation going on. And actually, like I said, the lower courts are going along with this. Of the 162 cases, 67 sought like a stop the presses preliminary injunction. Relief has been granted in almost 70% of those cases, which is to say the lower courts are holding the line. And there have been 39 different judges appointed by 5 different presidents that have ruled against Trump. So it's not partisan in the courts, at least not yet until it gets to the Supreme Court. So what we're seeing is that there's this pushback led by the lower states coming up. They still are independent, and the courts, which have not been entirely captured, are still independent. So is American democracy in danger? Well, yes, absolutely. But we're starting to see some pushback from the little places that are still left that have not yet been captured by that list that I gave you. And they're using this idea of rule of law writ large, right? You try to get the states to defend constitutionalism at national level, exactly the same way that my colleagues and I in the room here had tried to use EU law to come back at national state constitutions and try to fix them. So I think that's going to be the answer, and therefore it's not the end. So thank you all.